You said that everybody basically agreed that Israel should be supported in its response at the beginning. But, there were people, I'm thinking about Josh Paul, who was the director in the State Department's Bureau of Political and Military Affairs. He resigned in October 2023. And I just want to quote something from what he said in his resignation letter and hear how it strikes you. He wrote, "The United States government has actual knowledge that these arms, the arms it was sending to Israel, will be and are being used to commit human rights violations both in the West Bank, in terms of firearms provided to units credibly alleged to have committed gross violations of human rights, and in Gaza, in terms of both firearms which have been used to conduct extrajudicial killings, and in terms of air-to-ground munitions, artillery rounds, and tank shells." And then later, "I can say with confidence that the United States has actual knowledge that its arms will be used to commit such violations." And then later, "As such, the U.S. is in violation of its own policies and laws, including the conventional arms transfer policy that I helped draft." So he's saying basically, and this is a guy who's kind of working on these arms transfers, we know that Israel is using American weapons, will be and is already using to commit gross human rights violations, which violates U.S. law. And so I'm just curious how you respond to that.
So a couple of things. I mean, you're right. I said everyone was for supporting Israel and making sure it had, when I say everyone, I don't mean every single person in the U.S. system. You asked about the national security team, the White House, the people around the president. The view was Israel should be supported. Now, over time, that changed in some people's minds, and there may have been already people in the system, Josh Paul or others, who disagreed with it from the start. My point was simply that, in those first weeks of October, the view was we need to make sure Israel has what it needs. I'll get to this point about human rights violations, but I also want to say, because you asked me, to finish the thought on what some of us believed should be done to make sure Israel didn't go too far. And I said, in some ways that included the president. He sent some U.S. generals with experience in Iraq and Fallujah over to Israel in the first weeks as part of this, don't make the mistakes we did. There are ways to respond to a terrorist group that don't entail mass displacement and mass civilian casualties. And we were very concerned about a ground invasion. Looking back, again, this could be a whole other discussion. In the end, it turned out that the airstrikes were probably even more damaging than going in on the ground. But in those early days and weeks, we were concerned about a ground assault that would kill a lot of civilians and potentially get Israel bogged down. And again, sent a team over. So that wasn't just something that I or the vice president supported. The president did that because the entire team was worried about Israeli overreach leading to civilian casualties, violations of human rights, and humanitarian suffering, which brings me to actually the question that you asked. Very early on, within weeks of those operations, there was concern throughout, and again, right up through the president, that Israel was causing too many civilian casualties, and that more would come if they continued the war in that way. And everyone was concerned about how we could use our policy to prevent that. And that's where these differences come in, and it leads to a problem that I still honestly don't know a perfect way around, which is the moral hazard of our commitment to make sure Israel had what it needed to defend itself against others. And, when you cite Josh Paul and those who think we should have changed our policy, from the start, as soon as we began to be uncomfortable with certain aspects of it, to the extent that that means an arms embargo or cut off Israel, it was certainly not something the president was prepared to do, but I think all of us were concerned about the consequences of that. So yes, let's say you're concerned about the humanitarian situation in Gaza or lack of compliance with international humanitarian law and even U.S. law. It doesn't make it easy to simply say, and therefore we're going to do things that would leave Israel vulnerable. And more than anything, and I'm explaining this because I'm critical of it myself. I think we fell into this trap that because Israel faced real threats from Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, hundreds of ballistic missiles from Iran, we didn't want to use that leverage. We also didn't want to do anything that would lead Hamas to drive an even harder bargain. I mean, Hamas wanted us to split with Israel. So those are reasons I think it wasn't so simple. And again, I'm trying to explain what was on the president's mind, even without entirely defending it. That's why it wasn't so simple to say, at the end of October, we're concerned about what's taking place here, and therefore we're going to cut off Israel and stop supplying arms to it, because that would have real consequences too. Now, again, in my view, it got to a point, and I think every individual will make up their own mind when that point was, sometime between mid-October and the Trump administration. And you've probably seen I've written publicly, together with John Feiner, a piece saying that in our view, much earlier than the end of our administration, we needed to use that leverage because the humanitarian situation in Gaza really got to unacceptable levels. But I'm trying to explain why in those early weeks, even if there were maybe some people in the system saying we already have evidence of violations and therefore should cut Israel off, it wasn't so simple. And you'd be doing that while there were hostages in Gaza, while Sinwar and the other leaders were still alive, while the tunnel network was still there. That wasn't an obvious policy choice to make then, even if over time some of us came around with the view that the U.S. had to use more leverage.
I guess what strikes me is the discourse that you're using is very different than the kind of discourse he's engaging in. You're saying there were difficult policy choices because we were concerned about that Israel might be threatened by other actors, and we're concerned about how Hamas is going to react. He's just saying these are violations of U.S. law. We are violating U.S. law by sending these weapons. We already know that Israel is using them to commit gross human rights violations. So it seems to me like, do you think he's wrong on that? Or can one just put those questions aside as one is balancing these policy questions?
I wouldn't say you put them aside, and these are serious allegations, and I believe the United States should respect international humanitarian law, and that needed to lead to a change in our policy. I am, though, saying absolutely that that you need to balance it with other considerations. You could take a view, we're going to just absolutely strictly read the law and therefore not deliver any arms to Israel. That's a legitimate, respectable view, but you can't do that and ignore the consequences of that decision. If you want to take the view that therefore, and as early as whenever that might have been, October, November, that you're going to not supply Israel with any arms at all, even as you're genuinely worried that Hezbollah is going to launch rockets on Tel Aviv, that Iran would be prepared to do the same, that Hamas would keep up the fight, keep the hostages, and rule Gaza. You just have to own the consequences of that decision. And that's the president wasn't close to being there. Like I said, over time, I came to the view that the situation in Gaza was that Israel had already done what it needed to do to dismantle the threat, the strategic threat to Israel from Hamas, and the balance was way out of proportion. And that did require a change in U.S. policy and leverage.
But I guess putting aside international law, I think what Josh Paul is talking about is, in particular, the Leahy law, the law about U.S. law. Was there a conversation about whether the United States might be violating its own law? I mean, again, Israel, on October 9th, Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, said no electricity, no food, no water, no fuel. So was there a conversation about whether these policies simply were in violation of U.S. law?
Yes, from the start, and it's good you brought up the Gallant thing, because that's something that our administration reacted to, and this is a big difference with the Trump administration. We'll get to that. I'm not trying to defend in any way the Biden record, because, as I said, ultimately it was a failure, certainly on the humanitarian side. But one difference between Biden and Trump is, every single day during our administration, we were trying to get the Israelis to let in more humanitarian aid, which, by the way, would be in order to make sure it was compliant with our domestic law and international humanitarian law, and to avoid civilian casualties. And I think we had an impact on that. Not enough of one, but we had an impact, in contrast to Trump, who basically said, finish the job, you can do whatever you want, which led to a total blockade of Gaza for 2 months, which is what led to widespread famine. But again, to answer your question, yes, and that when Gallant said that, our reaction was, no, that's a gross violation of, even aside from law, of our morality. And the reason we're standing with Israel is supposed to be defending our common values, and that's unacceptable. And we pushed, and that's another thing Biden said on October 18th when he went to Israel. Of course, he said, we've got your back. He warned others not to intervene. But he also said, you guys got to deliver food and water and electricity. And we had those debates at the highest levels with the Israeli government, and some of them were saying, we can't deliver electricity. They use it to air-conditioned tunnels in Gaza. And we're like, yes, they do, but they also use it to stay alive. And you can't do that.
This has been a free preview of my conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest and support my work, please consider subscribing at peterbeinart.substack.com.